The first thing Amara tasted was copper. Not the copper of old pennies found in winter coat pockets. Not the copper of tap water running too long through rusted pipes in her grandmother's house back in Atlanta. No, this was the copper of her own blood pooling in the back of her throat, warm and thick, sliding down like a confession she never wanted to make. She was on her knees. The concrete beneath her was so cold it burned through the thin fabric of her dress. A black silk thing Jun Seo had bought her in Gangnam 3 months ago, back when his hands still trembled when they touched her face. Back when he whispered her name like it was a prayer he didn't deserve to speak. Now that same dress was torn at the shoulder, and the man standing above her, the one pressing the muzzle of a Beretta against the crown of her head, was not a stranger. He was Kong Dae-jung, Jun Seo's oldest friend, his blood brother in the syndicate, the man who had once held a door open for her and said in broken English, "Sister, you are safe here." That was 7 months ago. Tonight the warehouse smelled of diesel fuel, fish rot from the docks outside, and something else. Something metallic and ancient that Amara had come to recognize as the scent of a decision already made. "You were told to leave Korea." Dae-jung's voice echoed off corrugated steel walls. It was flat, clinical, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis he'd given 100 times before. Madame Kwan was generous. She offered you money, a new identity, passage to any country you chose. Amara lifted her chin. Blood dripped from her split lip onto the concrete, and the sound of each drop hitting the floor was louder than it should have been. Tap, 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 like a clock counting down something irreversible. "I didn't ask for her generosity," Amara said. Her voice didn't shake. She wouldn't give them that. 27 years of being a black woman in spaces that didn't want her had built something inside Amara that bullets couldn't touch. "I asked for the father of my children to look me in my eyes. That's all I've ever asked." Dae-jung's jaw tightened. She saw it. That flicker of something human behind the mask. He shifted his weight. The gun trembled, just barely, like a leaf deciding whether to fall. "The children," he said, quieter now. "Madame Kwan knows about the children." The air in the warehouse changed. Amara felt it in her chest. A pressure drop, the way the atmosphere shifts right before a hurricane makes landfall. She'd felt that pressure once before, standing in the doorway of her mother's hospital room in Grady Memorial, watching monitors flatline, knowing that the woman who'd taught her to press her shoulders back and walk like she owned every room, that woman was leaving, and no amount of prayer or bargaining would bring her back. This was that same feeling. "She knows," Amara repeated, and it wasn't a question. She knows it's not one child. Dae-jung lowered the gun 2 inches. Not enough to matter, just enough to reveal that whatever was coming next even made him uncomfortable. "She knows it's 3. 3. The word hung in the warehouse like smoke. Amara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, 8 months swollen, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. 3 lives, 3 futures, 3 hearts beating inside her that sounded, when the ultrasound technician had turned up the volume last week, like a drum circle, layered, syncopated, alive with a rhythm only God could compose. Triplets. In the Kwan dynasty, triplets hadn't been born in over 200 years. The last time it happened, those 3 sons had overthrown the reigning patriarch and split the empire into the modern structure it held today. Triplets were not just rare. In the mythology of the Korean underworld, triplets were an omen, a shift in the axis of power so profound that every family, every territory, every alliance would be forced to recalculate. And now Amara, a black woman from the west side of Atlanta, a woman who had met Jun Seo Kwon in a graduate lecture hall at Seoul National University, a woman whose grandmother had cleaned white folks' houses so her daughter could go to Spelman, so her daughter could earn a scholarship to study international law in South Korea. That woman was carrying the most powerful genetic event in the Kwon bloodline's history, and the matriarch wanted her erased. "What did she tell you to do, Dae-jung?" Amara's voice was steady, but her eyes were doing something else entirely. They were reading him, every micro-expression, every breath. She'd learned that from her mother, who could walk into any room and tell you within 30 seconds who was lying, who was afraid, and who was about to cause trouble. "Did she tell you to kill me? Or did she tell you to make me disappear?" Dae-jung said nothing. "Because there's a difference," Amara continued, and now she leaned forward closer to the gun, not away from it. "If she said kill me, then you're a murderer of a pregnant woman, and the Kwon ancestors will curse your line for 10 generations. But if she said make me disappear," she paused. "Let the silence work. Then you have a choice." 12 hours earlier, on the other side of Seoul, the Kwon estate had been immaculate. The compound sat on 40 acres of manicured hillside in Byeongchang-dong, the kind of neighborhood where old money didn't whisper. It simply existed, like oxygen, like the assumption of superiority that came with 5 centuries of accumulated power. The gardens were designed in the Jongwon style, controlled wilderness, every stone and stream positioned to create the illusion of nature while maintaining absolute human authority over every leaf and shadow. Madame Kwon Soo-yeon stood at the window of her private study, watching the sunrise burn orange across the mountain ridge. She was 63 years old. Her posture was that of a woman who had never once in her life been unsure of what to do next. She wore a hanbok of deep indigo, hand-stitched by a seamstress in Jeonju who had served 3 generations of Kwon women. Her hair was pulled back so tightly that her face seemed carved from marble, beautiful, ancient, and utterly without mercy. In her right hand, she held a porcelain cup of boricha, barley tea, still steaming. In her left, she held a photograph. The photograph showed Amara, not the Amara of the warehouse, bloodied, kneeling, defiant. This was Amara from a year ago, captured by the family's surveillance team. She was walking through Bukchon Hanok village, laughing at something Jun Seo had said. Her braids were long, swept over one shoulder. Jun Seo was looking at her the way men look at women who have rearranged the architecture of their entire soul. Helpless, devoted, gone. Madame Kwon studied the photograph with the detachment of a general reviewing a battlefield map. She did not hate Amara. This is what people never understood about Soo-yeon, what even her own son failed to grasp. She did not operate from hatred. Hatred was a luxury for people who could afford emotional decisions. Soo-yeon had not made an emotional decision since the night her husband, the great Kwon Tai-ho, had been assassinated at a peace summit in Busan, shot through the throat by a man he'd considered a brother. She'd been 31. Jun Seo had been 4. And in the 20 minutes it took for the ambulance to arrive, 20 minutes she spent pressing her bare hands against her husband's neck, feeling his life pulse through her fingers and onto the marble floor. She made a vow. No one outside this bloodline will ever have the power to destroy us again. That vow had governed every decision for 32 years, every alliance, every marriage arrangement, every strategic elimination. It was not cruelty. It was architecture. She was building a structure that would outlive her son, outlive generations. And every brick had to be precisely placed. Amara was not a brick. Amara was an earthquake. The girl is remarkable, Soo-yeon said aloud, Though no one else was in the room, she said it without irony. She had researched Amara thoroughly. Her academic record, her family history, the way she'd navigated Seoul's institutional racism with a quiet, devastating intelligence that reminded Soo-yeon uncomfortably of herself at that age. In another world, I would have chosen her myself. But this was not another world. This was the world where the Park family controlled Incheon's ports, where the Lim Syndicate had been probing Kwon territory for 18 months, where the Japanese Yakuza alliance was fracturing and looking for Korean partnerships to exploit. This was the world where a mixed-race heir, no matter how brilliant, no matter how strong, would be used as a weapon by every rival family to delegitimize the Kwon succession, not because the child would be less, but because the world would treat the child as less. And Soo-yeon refused to build her legacy on a foundation that the world's cruelty could crack. She set the photograph down, picked up her phone, dialed. "Dae-jung," she said. "Tonight, before the wedding. Handle the situation with discretion. I want her relocated, not harmed. Deposit the funds in the Swiss account. And Dae-jung..." She paused, looked out the window again. The sunrise was fully formed now, golden and indifferent. "If she refuses to go, then I need you to understand what discretion means in this context." She ended the call. For a moment, just a moment, Soo-yeon allowed herself to feel the thing she kept locked in the deepest vault of her chest. Not guilt. Guilt was for people who believed they had options. What she felt was closer to grief. The specific surgical grief of a woman who recognized excellence in another woman and had to destroy it anyway because the system she'd built could not accommodate it. She remembered being 26, newly married to Tai-ho, sitting in a room full of his associates' wives who smiled at her face and whispered behind their silk fans that she was too ambitious, too sharp, too much. She remembered learning to fold herself smaller, to speak softer, to channel her intelligence through her husband's voice because the world would accept wisdom from his mouth but not from hers. She had spent decades unfolding herself back to full size after his death, and the process had cost her something essential. Some softness, some ability to see the world as anything other than a chessboard. Amara had that softness. Amara had not yet been forced to choose between power and tenderness, and some part of Soo-yeon, a part she would deny under torture, envied that. But envy, like guilt, was a luxury. Then she sat down at her desk and began reviewing the wedding arrangements for her son's marriage to Yoon Ha-eun, a woman from the Yoon family whose bloodline was so meticulously Korean that their genealogy registry went back to the Joseon dynasty without a single deviation. Ha-eun was elegant, obedient, strategic, and she would give the empire exactly what it needed, an heir that no one could question. What Soo-yeon did not know, what no amount of surveillance or intelligence had revealed, was that Ha-eun had secrets of her own. Secrets that would, in time, prove far more dangerous to the Kwon dynasty than anything Amara could ever represent. But that revelation was still months away. Tonight, there was a wedding to complete, and in a hospital bed 40 minutes south, Amara lay on her side, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting them the way her mother used to count ceiling tiles during chemotherapy. Methodically, rhythmically, turning physical agony into arithmetic because numbers don't hurt and the body needs somewhere to put its attention when the pain gets biblical. The contractions had started an hour ago. Too early, much too early. The doctor, a quiet woman named Dr. Shin, who'd been paid handsomely by Jun Seo to provide discreet prenatal care, pressed her stethoscope to Amara's belly and listened with the focused intensity of a musician tuning an instrument. 3 heartbeats, all present, all strong, But Amara's blood pressure was climbing in a way that made Dr. Shin's expression tighten at the edges. "Your body is under extreme stress," Dr. Shin said carefully, choosing her words the way someone chooses steps through a minefield. "The babies are viable at this stage, but if your pressure continues to rise—" "I know what happens if my pressure rises," Amara said. Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice of a woman who had Googled every possible complication of triplet pregnancy at 3 a.m. and memorized the statistics the way other people memorize prayers. "Preeclampsia, seizures, organ failure, I know." "Then you know I need you to stay calm." Amara almost laughed. Stay calm. She was carrying the secret heirs of a criminal empire. The father of her children was being married to another woman at this exact moment, and there was a reasonable chance that the most powerful woman in Korean organized crime had sent someone to kill her. Stay calm. But she did. Because calm was what her mother had been. Calm when the diagnosis came. Calm when the treatments failed. Calm on the last morning when she'd held Amara's hand and said, "Baby, I am not leaving you. I am going ahead to make sure the path is clear." Calm was not the absence of fear. Calm was fear, disciplined. Amara closed her eyes, breathed, counted ceiling tiles in her mind, and waited for whatever was coming next. Jun Seo Kwon stood at the altar of the underground chapel and felt nothing. That was not entirely true. He felt the weight of the dopo, the ceremonial silk robe pressing on his shoulders like a yoke. He felt the heat of 200 candles burning in iron sconces along the stone walls, their flames throwing shadows that danced like trapped spirits. He felt the eyes of 47 men and women, the inner circle of the Kwon Syndicate, watching him with expressions that ranged from approval to calculation to something that looked, in the dim light, like pity. But emotionally, he was a cathedral that had been emptied of its congregation, hollow, echoing, still architecturally impressive from the outside, but inside, nothing but dust and the memory of hymns. Hae-yoon stood across from him in a white hanbok, embroidered with gold chrysanthemums. She was beautiful in the way that museums are beautiful, curated, preserved, designed to be admired but never touched. Her eyes were steady, her hands were still. She had been prepared for this moment her entire life. The officiant won an elderly man whose loyalty to the Kwon family predated Jun Seo's birth, began the rites. His voice was a low chant, rhythmic and ancient, filling the chapel with sounds that vibrated in Jun Seo's chest like a second heartbeat. Jun Seo's mind was not in the chapel. It was in a small apartment in Itaewon, where the sheets still smelled like cocoa butter and lavender, where Amara kept a framed photograph of her mother on the nightstand, a woman named Lorraine, who had died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago, and whose face, even in photographs, radiated the kind of warmth that made you feel like you'd been wrapped in something you didn't know you needed. Where Amara would sit cross-legged on the floor at midnight, textbooks spread around her like a fortress, highlighting passages in yellow and green while humming Anita Baker songs she'd inherited from her grandmother's record collection. He had tried to call her 6 times tonight. Each call went to voicemail. He didn't know about the warehouse. He didn't know about Dai Jung. He didn't know about the gun or the blood or the choice his mother had set in motion. All he knew was this. The woman he loved was carrying his children, and he was standing in a chapel, marrying someone else. And the distance between those two truths was a canyon so vast that if he looked down into it, he would never stop falling. "Do you accept this union?" the officiant asked. Jun Seo opened his mouth. He thought of his father. Not the myth, Not Kwan Tae-ho, the legend, the patriarch, the name whispered in reverence across every territory from Seoul to Busan. He thought of his father, the man, the one who used to sit on the floor of Jun Seo's bedroom and build elaborate towers out of wooden blocks, only to let his 4-year-old son knock them down, laughing every time as if destruction was the funniest thing in the world. The one who, on the last morning of his life, had kissed Jun Seo's forehead and said, "Be good to the people who make you brave." Amara made him brave. Hyun made him appropriate. And in this world, in this chapel, in this empire, under his mother's architecture of control, appropriate had always won. "I accept," Jun Seo said. The words tasted like ash. Hyun's eyes flickered, not with joy, not with triumph, but with something closer to relief, the relief of a woman completing an assignment. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was there. And if Jun Seo had been looking at her instead of staring at the stone floor, he might have seen it, might have recognized it for what it was, but he wasn't looking. He was thinking about wooden blocks and a father who believed that the bravest thing a man could do was love without permission. And 4 miles south, in a warehouse that smelled of diesel and decisions, Amara made hers. "I have something your mistress doesn't have," Amara said to Dae-jung, still on her knees, still bleeding, still refusing to look anywhere but directly into his eyes. "And I'm not talking about the babies." Dae-jung's finger rested on the trigger guard. Not the trigger, the guard. A distinction that Amara noticed and filed away, because in the world she'd been living in for the past 2 years, the difference between a trigger and a trigger guard was the difference between a threat and a negotiation. "Speak quickly," he said. "Your boss, Jun Seo's mother, she thinks the biggest threat to the Kwan Empire is me. A black woman carrying mixed children, an outsider contaminating the bloodline." Amara shifted her weight, feeling the babies move inside her. A rolling, pressing sensation, as if even they understood that this moment mattered. But she's wrong. The biggest threat to the Kwan Empire is already inside the gates. Something changed in Dae-jung's posture, a stiffening, a recalibration. "I spent 14 months in that compound," Amara continued. "I sat in rooms where people assumed I couldn't understand Korean, but I studied Korean for 3 years before I ever set foot in Seoul. I understood every word, every whispered conversation, every phone call they thought was private because the black girl couldn't possibly—" She stopped herself, breathed, steadied. "Ha-eun, the woman your matriarch handpicked to be the perfect Korean bride. She's been feeding intelligence to the Park family for over a year. I have dates. I have names. I have the contents of 14 encrypted messages that I translated myself because I am very, very good at what I do." The warehouse was silent except for the distant sound of waves against the dock pilings and the mechanical hum of a generator somewhere in the building's guts. "You're lying," Dae-jung said. But he said it the way people say things they desperately hope are true. "I'm a woman on her knees with a gun to her head and 3 babies in her body," Amara said. "I have absolutely no reason to lie and every reason to give you the truth, because the truth is the only currency I have left." She reached, slowly, carefully, keeping her eyes locked on his, into the interior pocket of her torn dress. She withdrew a small USB drive, black, unremarkable, the size of her thumbnail. "Everything is on here, every piece of evidence. Hyun is not a bride. She's a Trojan horse. And if that wedding is completed tonight, the Park family will have a direct line into the heart of the Kwan Syndicate within 6 months." Dae-jung stared at the USB drive. Then he looked at Amara. And for the first time in this entire encounter, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't duty or threat or cold professionalism. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the person kneeling before him was not a victim to be managed. She was a strategist who had been playing a longer game than anyone in the Quan Empire had imagined. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Amara almost smiled. Almost. "Your matriarch spent 32 years building walls to keep outsiders from destroying the empire. But she forgot the oldest lesson in warfare, Daejung. The most dangerous enemy is the one you invite to dinner." He lowered the gun. Fully. Let it hang at his side. "If this is real, it's real. If this is real, then the wedding needs to be stopped, but not by you." Amara rose from her knees. The movement was slow, heavy with the weight of 3 lives, but there was something regal in it. The way she unfolded, the way she pressed her shoulders back, the way she stood at her full height and looked at this armed man as if he was the one who should be afraid. It needs to be stopped by the only person whose word the matriarch cannot ignore. "Junseo won't—" "Not Junseo." Amara's eyes were fierce now, lit with something that went beyond strategy into the territory of a mother protecting not just her children, but her children's future. "Me. Take me to the chapel. Take me to Madame Quan, and let me show her that the outsider she tried to erase is the only person who can save her empire." The chapel doors were 8 feet of reinforced oak, carved with dragons that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. When they opened, they didn't creak. They groaned, like the earth shifting, like something ancient and heavy being disturbed. Every head turned. Amara stood in the doorway. Her dress was torn. Her lip was split. Her braids were loose around her shoulders, and there was blood, dried now, a dark map across her collarbone. She was breathing hard. One hand rested on her belly. The other held the USB drive between 2 fingers, raised like a torch. The silence that fell over the chapel was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of a world rearranging itself. The moment before an earthquake when every living thing goes still, because the ground beneath them has decided to become something else. Junseo saw her first. His face, which had been a mask of hollow obedience for the past hour, shattered. There was no other word for it. Every wall he'd built, every layer of duty and resignation and forced acceptance collapsed in a single second. His eyes went wide, his lips parted, and then something happened that no one in that chapel had ever seen before. Junseo Kwon, heir to the most powerful syndicate in Korea, stepped away from the altar. Amara. He said her name like a man saying it for the first time, like a man who had been drowning and just broke the surface. Amara. "Sit down." Madame Kwan's voice cut through the chapel like a blade through silk. She had not moved from her seat in the front row. Her back was straight. Her face betrayed nothing, but her hands, folded in her lap, were white-knuckled, the tendons standing out like bridge cables under strain. "This woman has no place here." "This woman," Amara said, walking forward, slowly, deliberately, each step a declaration, "has the evidence that will determine whether your empire survives the next 6 months." She walked past the rows of syndicate members, past the bodyguards who reached for weapons and then hesitated, because Daejing had entered behind her and given them a signal, a barely perceptible shake of the head. That meant stand down. Past Ha-eun, whose face had gone from composed to something Amara recognized instantly, the particular stillness of a person whose lie is about to be exposed. Amara stopped directly in front of Madame Kwan, 2 women, one standing, one seated. Between them, the weight of generations, continents, and every assumption the world had ever made about who belonged where and why. "You tried to erase me," Amara said. Her voice was low, but in the acoustic perfection of that stone chapel, every syllable reached every ear. "You sent a man with a gun to remove me from your son's story, from your empire's future, because I am black. Because I am foreign, because my blood doesn't match the blood in your genealogy books." Madame Kwan did not blink. "You oversimplify." "Then let me be specific." Amara held up the USB drive. "Your hand-picked bride, the woman standing at that altar in white and gold, has been communicating with Park Joon-ho for 14 months. She has provided detailed intelligence on your shipping routes, your financial structures, and your alliance network. The Park family isn't probing your territory, Madame Kwan. They've been invited in by the woman you chose to protect your precious bloodline." The chapel erupted, not in sound, in movement. The subtle, dangerous movement of 47 people simultaneously reassessing every assumption they'd operated under. Heads turned toward Hyun. Hands moved toward weapons. The energy in the room shifted from ceremony to something predatory. Hyun's mask cracked. "That's a lie," she said, but her voice was thin, reedy, a voice trying to hold a shape it could no longer maintain. "Then you won't mind if we examine the drive," Amara said. She wasn't looking at Ha-eun, she was still looking at Madame Kwan, because Amara understood something fundamental about power structures. You don't address the puppet, you address the hand. Madame Kwan was silent for a long time. The candles flickered. Somewhere above them, the real world continued. Cars and commerce and people living ordinary lives, unaware that beneath them, in a chapel built for the rituals of an empire, a black woman from Atlanta was holding the fate of a dynasty in her hand. "Give me the drive," Madame Kwan said finally. "No." Amara closed her fist around it. "First we talk, woman to woman, mother to mother." The word mother landed like a stone in still water, because Madame Kwan knew. She'd known since the medical report crossed her desk 3 days ago. She knew about the triplets. She knew what triplets meant in the Kwan mythology. And she knew, though she would never admit it aloud, that the woman standing before her, bloodied and unbowed, carrying 3 lives that could reshape the entire hierarchy of the Korean underworld, was not an outsider threatening the empire. She was the empire's future, whether Soo-yeon wanted her to be or not. "Everyone out," Madame Kwan said. "Mother," Junseo started. "Everyone." The chapel emptied in 90 seconds. The guards, the syndicate members, Ha-eun, escorted firmly by Dae-jung, who had already begun making calls. And finally, Junseo, who looked at Amara with an expression that contained an entire language of regret and love and desperation, and who left only because Amara gave him the smallest nod. "Trust me," that nod said. "I've got this." And then it was just the two of them, the matriarch and the mother. They sat facing each other in the front pew. The candles had burned lower, and the light was softer now. Amber and forgiving, the kind of light that makes truth easier to speak. "You remind me of someone," Madame Kwan said. It was not the opening Amara expected. "Who?" "Myself." Soo-yeon's voice had changed, not softer exactly, but different, like an instrument switching keys. "When I was 31, I knelt on a marble floor in Busan and held my husband's life in my hands and watched it leave. I was pregnant with Junseo. I was alone. I was surrounded by men who assumed that without my husband, I was nothing. A widow to be managed, a footnote in someone else's story." She turned to look at Amara directly. "I proved them wrong. Every single one of them. It took me 32 years, and I buried parts of myself I will never recover. But I built something that no one could take from me or my son. And in building it, Amara said gently, you decided that anyone who didn't look like your blueprint was a threat. I decided that the world is cruel to those it considers different, and I refuse to let my grandson or granddaughter bear the weight of that cruelty. With respect, Madame Kwan, you don't get to decide what weight my children can bear. That's my job. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of two women recognizing, perhaps for the first time, that they were speaking the same language, the language of mothers who would burn the world to protect what they'd created. My mother, Amara said, cleaned houses in Buckhead. That's the wealthy part of Atlanta. For 23 years. She ironed white women's sheets and scrubbed white men's toilets and smiled through every humiliation because she had a plan. Her plan was me. Her plan was Spellman. Her plan was a daughter who would walk into rooms that her mother was only allowed to clean. Amara's voice trembled for the first time, not from weakness, from the sacred weight of invoking her mother's memory in a place like this. She didn't protect me by keeping me away from the world's cruelty. She protected me by making me strong enough to walk through it. And that's what I intend to do for my children. Our grandchildren, whether you accept that or not. Madame Kwan looked down at her hands. For the first time all evening, she looked her age. Not diminished, deepened. The way ancient trees look when the light hits them right, and you can see every ring, every year, every storm survived. The drive, she said. Is the intelligence real? Every bite. And Ha-Eun. She was recruited by the Park family when she was 19, before you ever selected her. They've been planning this for years, Madame Kwan. They knew your blind spot, your obsession with bloodline purity, and they exploited it. They gave you exactly what you wanted to see, and you never looked deeper because she was Korean and elite and acceptable. Amara let that word breathe. Let it fill the space between them. Because acceptable was a word that Amara had lived with her entire life. The constant, exhausting performance of making yourself palatable to systems that were never designed to welcome you. She'd been acceptable at the predominantly white law firm where she'd interned in Atlanta, wearing her hair straight, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, being twice as prepared as everyone else just to be considered equal. She'd been acceptable in Seoul, learning to bow at precisely the right angle, mastering honorifics, eating foods that burned her tongue without flinching, because every misstep would be attributed not to her as an individual, but to her entire race. She was done being acceptable. She was going to be undeniable. The word acceptable hung in the air like an accusation and an education simultaneously. Madame Kwan closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted. Not a surrender, not an apology, but a recalibration. The same kind of recalibration she'd made on that marble floor in Busan 32 years ago, when the world as she knew it ended and she had to build a new one from whatever was left. "What do you want?" Suyan asked. "I want my children to know their father. I want them to know their grandmother. I want them to carry the Kwan name and mine. I want a seat at the table. Not as a guest, not as a concession, but as a partner. Because I have spent 2 years studying your world, Madame Kwan, and I understand it. I understand the alliances, the economics, the pressure points. I'm not just the mother of your grandchildren. I am an asset. And you don't survive in this world by throwing away your strongest assets." "And the evidence against Ha-Eun?" Amara placed the USB drive on the pew between them. "Consider it a gift, from one mother to another." What followed in the hours after that conversation moved with the precision and brutality of a surgical strike. The intelligence on the USB drive was verified within 40 minutes by the Kwon Syndicate's tech division, a team of 6 that operated from a basement in Gangnam that was, on paper, a cryptocurrency consulting firm. Every claim Amara had made was confirmed, every encrypted message decoded, every meeting between Ha-eun and Park Joon-ho time-stamped and geolocated. Ha-eun was detained in a room adjacent to the chapel. She did not deny the charges. There was no point. Instead, she sat in a straight-backed chair, her wedding handbook still pristine, and said something that surprised everyone. "Your mother," she said to Jun Seo, who stood across from her with the expression of a man reassembling his understanding of the past 2 years. "Approached my family when I was 17. She evaluated me like livestock. My education, my genetics, my temperament, all cataloged, all measured against her standards. The Parks offered me something she never did." "What?" Jun Seo asked. "A choice." The word landed heavily, because Ha-eun was not wrong, and everyone in the room knew it. The machinery that Madame Kwon had built, the architecture of control, the careful curation of bloodlines and alliances, it didn't just trap outsiders, it trapped insiders too. Ha-eun had been recruited by the Parks, yes, but she'd been created by the Kwon system, molded into an instrument, denied agency, and then blamed when she sought it elsewhere. Jun Seo looked at Ha-eun for a long time. Then he said something that no one expected. "I'm sorry." Ha-eun's composure broke. Not dramatically. Just a single tear, tracking down her cheek like a hairline fracture in porcelain. "The marriage is dissolved," Madame Kwon announced from the doorway. Her voice was steel again, but a different kind of steel, tempered, not brittle. "Ha-eun will be relocated under protection. She will not be harmed. The Park family will be dealt with through appropriate channels." "And the intelligence she provided them?" Dae-jung asked. "We will feed them misinformation through the same channels. Let them act on what they think they know. When they move, we'll be ready." It was, Amara realized, watching from the corner of the room with her hands on her belly, a masterwork of strategic adaptation. Madame Kwon had taken a catastrophic betrayal, and within hours converted it into a tactical advantage. And then Soo-yeon turned to her. The 2 women locked eyes across the room. Between them was a history of violence, deception, and the kind of cultural chasm that most people never even attempt to cross. But there was also something else, something that Amara recognized because her mother had taught her to see it, even in the most unlikely places. Respect. "You will stay in the compound," Madame Kwon said. It was not a request, but it wasn't a command either. It was something in between, an offering wrapped in the only language Soo-yeon knew how to speak. "The medical staff will attend to you. The children will be born safely, and when they are born—" She paused. The chapel's remaining candles flickered. "We will discuss the future." The triplets arrived 17 days later, on a Tuesday morning in March, when the cherry blossoms along the Kwon Estate's Central Avenue were just beginning to open. Pale pink against a sky so blue it looked painted. Amara's labor lasted 11 hours. It was brutal, beautiful, and terrifying in equal measure. Jun Seo was beside her for every second, holding her hand so tightly that her bones ached, whispering in Korean and English, a desperate, tender, bilingual stream of encouragement that made the medical team exchange glances because they had never seen the heir to the Kwon Empire look so completely, vulnerably human. The first baby arrived at 6:47 a.m. A girl. She screamed before she was fully delivered, a sound so fierce and immediate that the head doctor actually laughed and said, "This one has opinions." The second arrived at 7:12 a.m. A boy. He was quiet, watchful, his dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that seemed impossible for a newborn. Jun Seo wept when he held him, full, shaking, ugly weeping, the kind that a man only does when every wall he's ever built comes down simultaneously. The third arrived at 7:34 a.m. Another girl, she came into the world with her fist raised, and Amara, exhausted, split open, more alive than she had ever been, laughed through her tears and said, "That's my grandmother. That's Lorraine right there." They named them Kwan Seo-ah, meaning auspicious and elegant. For the girl who announced herself before she arrived, Kwan Tai-min, carrying his grandfather's name, the one who was taken too soon in Busan. For the boy who watched the world like he was already planning how to change it, Kwan Lorraine, a name that broke every convention in the Kwan genealogy and caused a minor scandal among the traditional families. For the girl who arrived fighting, named after a woman who cleaned houses and raised queens. When Madame Kwan entered the room, she did so without announcement. She simply appeared in the doorway, still impeccable, still commanding, but somehow smaller in this context, not diminished, humbled, the way anyone becomes humble in the presence of new life. She approached the bassinets, looked down at the three sleeping faces. These children who were half Korean and half black, who carried the genetics of Joseon dynasty warriors and Atlanta seamstresses, of syndicate patriarchs and gospel choir directors, of centuries of power and centuries of resilience. Soo-yeon reached down and touched Taemin's cheek with one finger. The baby stirred, yawned, settled. "He has his grandfather's jawline," she said softly. "And his grandmother's stubbornness," Amara replied from the bed. Soo-yeon looked at her, and for the first time, the very first time, she smiled. It was small, reluctant, a flower blooming in soil that had been frozen for decades. "Both grandmothers," she said. "The months that followed were not easy. Nothing worth building ever is." The Park family moved on the misinformation Madame Kwan had planted, committing resources to a phantom shipping route that led them into a devastating confrontation with the Lim Syndicate. A conflict that consumed both rival families and left the Kwan Empire as the unchallenged power in Korean organized crime for the first time in a generation. Amara did not sit on the sidelines. She established herself, methodically, brilliantly, and with a patience that infuriated those who underestimated her, as a strategic advisor to the Kwan inner circle. Her background in international law, combined with her fluency in Korean and her intimate understanding of Western financial systems, made her invaluable. She restructured the syndicate's legitimate business fronts, created legal firewalls that would have taken traditional lawyers years to design, and, most importantly, built relationships with the wives and mothers of allied families, creating a network of influence that operated in the spaces that men never thought to watch. Jun Seo and Amara did not have a fairy tale. They had something better. They had a partnership forged in fire, tested by betrayal, and sustained by the daily, unglamorous work of choosing each other even when the world made it difficult. They fought. They disagreed. There were nights when the distance between their cultures felt unbridgeable. Nights when Amara would stand in the kitchen of the compound at 2 a.m, craving her mother's cornbread and finding nothing but teok and rice flour. And the loneliness would hit her so hard, she'd have to sit on the cold tile floor and cry quietly so she wouldn't wake the babies. There were mornings when Jun Seo would say something careless about adjusting, and Amara would look at him with eyes that could cut steel and say, "I have adjusted my entire life. When does the world adjust to me?" And he would have no answer. Because there was no answer. There was only the willingness to stay in the room when the conversation got hard, to hold the discomfort without fleeing into silence or authority, to say, "I don't understand yet, but I'm not leaving." That was love, not the cinematic kind, the real kind, the kind that looks like two people doing dishes after a fight, not speaking, but standing close enough that their elbows touch. The kind that Amara's grandmother would have recognized. The love that doesn't need a soundtrack because it lives in the ordinary moments, in the choosing, in the staying. And there were mornings when the sight of their children, three toddlers tearing through the Kwan estate like a beautiful, chaotic storm, babbling in a hybrid language that was part Korean, part English, and part something entirely their own, made every struggle worth enduring. Madame Kwan's transformation was the slowest and most profound of all. She did not become warm. She did not become soft. She remained the matriarch, strategic, formidable, occasionally terrifying. But she began to learn something that 32 years of control had prevented her from understanding. Strength does not require uniformity. She learned it watching Amara braid Seoa's hair on the veranda, while humming a hymn that her own grandmother had sung in a church in East Point, Georgia. She learned it watching Tae Min toddle through the garden, picking up stones and placing them in careful arrangements that echoed the Jongwon style, the ordered wilderness, as if the aesthetic of this place was already in his blood. She learned it watching little Lorraine, who at 18 months had figured out how to open every locked cabinet in the compound, and who looked at the world with an expression that said, very clearly, "Try to stop me." One evening, Soo-yeon sat in her study with a cup of barley tea, the same spot where, a year ago, she had ordered Amara's removal, and she called her son. "The naming ceremony for the triplets," she said. "I want it held in the main hall. Full honors, all families invited." There was a pause on Jun Seo's end. "Mother, the traditional families will attend, and they will bow, because these children are Kwan, and Kwan does not bow to tradition. Tradition bows to us." It was perhaps the most revolutionary thing Soo-yeon had ever said, not because it rejected the past, but because it expanded the future. The naming ceremony took place on a September evening when the air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. The main hall of the Kwan compound was transformed. Lanterns of red and gold hung from cedar beams, and someone, at Amara's suggestion, had woven strands of kente cloth between the traditional Korean decorations, creating a visual fusion that was startling and beautiful, and utterly without precedent. Amara stood at the center of the hall in a gown that was half hanbok, half something else entirely. Designed by a Korean seamstress and an African-American textile artist who had spent 3 weeks arguing, collaborating, and ultimately creating something neither could have made alone. It was deep burgundy silk with gold embroidery and indigo stitching, and when Amara moved, the fabric caught the lantern light and seemed to contain every color at once. She held Lorraine on her hip. Jun Seo stood beside her, Tae Min in his arms, and Madame Kwan, in an image that every syndicate family would remember for generations, held Seoa, her eldest great-granddaughter, against her chest with a tenderness that seemed to physically hurt her, as if her body had forgotten how to hold something gently and was relearning in real time. The heads of 12 allied families were present. Some had come willingly. Others had come because refusing an invitation from Madame Kwan was not something anyone did twice. All of them looked at the triplets, these mixed-race children who carried the most powerful genetic omen in Korean underworld mythology, and understood that the world they had known was over. What replaced it was uncertain, messy, unprecedented, but it was alive. And Amara, standing in a hall that 1 year ago she would not have been allowed to enter, surrounded by people who had tried to erase her, holding a child named after a woman who scrubbed floors so that one day her granddaughter could stand in exactly this kind of room. Amara leaned over to Jun Seo and whispered, "Your mother is smiling again." Jun Seo looked at Soo-yeon. It was true, small, guarded, almost invisible, but real. "She does that now," he whispered back, "only when she thinks no one is watching." Someone is always watching, Amara said. That's the first thing your world taught me. Jun Seo looked at her. This woman who had walked into a chapel bleeding and unbowed, who had turned a death sentence into a negotiation, who had saved an empire by being exactly what that empire had tried to reject. It's not my world anymore, he said. It's ours. The ceremony began. The officiant's voice rose. 3 names were spoken into the hall and carried upward by the heat of lanterns and the weight of history. Names that belonged to 2 cultures, 2 continents, 2 legacies that the world had always kept separate, and that 3 small children, simply by existing, had fused into something new. And in the back of the hall, unseen by anyone, Daejung stood in the shadows and watched. He had not spoken about the warehouse since that night. He never would, but he kept, in the inside pocket of his jacket, a small photograph, taken by a security camera on the night everything changed, of a woman on her knees, blood on her face, looking up at a gun with an expression that he had come to realize was not defiance. It was certainty, the certainty of a woman who knew, even in the worst moment of her life, that she was not the one who should be afraid. He had seen many powerful people in his years serving the Kwan family, men who commanded armies, women who controlled billions, leaders who could end lives with a phone call, but he had never seen anyone as powerful as a mother who had already decided that her children would live. The lanterns burned late into the night. The cherry trees outside had lost their blossoms months ago, but new buds were already forming, tight, green, patient, waiting for their season. 3 children slept in the heart of an empire that had tried to deny them, and the empire held them anyway, because empires, like families, do not survive by staying the same. They survive by becoming brave enough to change. The end.